So I got this question on Bunny Boots Discord server. Thank you. I appreciate your compliment on my First Amendment audit video. And I'll scroll through it ever so slightly. Basically, it comes down to this. There is a reason why elected officials, so on a state level, judges are typically elected. On the federal level, judges are not elected, and they're not elected for a very specific reason. It's by design. It's because the framers of the Constitution didn't want judges to be swayed by the popular opinion, the emotional swell of the day. They wanted the judges to be able to make the unpopular decision because that's what the law demanded. I know in today's kind of society, it feels like judges are more swayed by their own politics as we're going through these nomination processes, like with the Supreme Court right now. It all seems very partisan. But at the end of the day, the intent behind the framers making the judiciary, basically a life appointment and they could only be kicked out for good cause, was to insulate them from the popular will. And that's one of the reasons why it's so funny, odd, weird, stupid to see these people doing call floods against judges. Judges are not supposed to be swayed by popular outcry, by the current passions of society, because we don't want them to react to who's crying the loudest. We want them to react on what the law is. And there's also a reason why the legislative branches and the executive branches are directly accountable to the people through elections. And that's because we want them to be reactive. And they strike a balance. If the legislators pass a statute that the governor signs or the president signs, now it's a law. The judiciary, because they are not swayed by public support, can put the brakes on that. If it's unconstitutional or whatever, they can say, hey, look, you're doing it all wrong. You can't do this. And that's good. That's a balance. But then if they say, instead of saying it's not constitutional, let's just say that they look at this statute, this poorly written statute, and they're like, wow, the legislative branch really screwed the pooch on this. It's completely vague. We have no idea what they were trying to do. So we're going to have to interpret this as best we can. And our best guess is that it was intended to be this. And so they make their ruling based on that. Now, if that is not the right ruling, if that's not what the legislative branch intended or what the people want, then through a combination of pressure on the legislative branch or by the legislative branch wanting to do it on their own, they can rewrite that statute or write a new statute, amend it, however you want to say it, get it signed by the governor, and then that new statute will overturn, essentially, the previous ruling by the judges. And so there's checks and balances involved. Now, qualified immunity is a federal thing. It's federal common law. I know federal common law doesn't exist, but hey, guess what? It exists. Qualified immunity is a creature that the federal courts came up with to expeditiously get rid of frivolous lawsuits. Every single person who's been arrested by the cops wants to get revenge on them. And so there's no like bar you have to hurdle besides a filing fee to file a lawsuit. And, if you're poor enough, the courts can even waive the filing fee. So it's a real easy tool to be abused. And so the courts have said, the federal courts have said, hey, look, we don't want these cops to just be basically beggared by having to pay for attorney's fees over all these frivolous lawsuits. So we want to make it as easy as possible to weed out the claims that don't have any merit. And so the very first thing they do is they look to see if it has merit, and then they get rid of it under qualified immunity. If it does have merit, what they're looking at is they're going to see if the officer acted in good faith. Honest mistakes, the purpose of these lawsuits is not just to make the plaintiff whole, but it's also kind of to dissuade the police from violating your rights. So if the police officer was acting in good faith, and I know some of you people believe that the police are incapable of acting in good faith, but surprisingly enough, they're not. If the police are acting in good faith, then the courts will be like, hey, you know what? It's an open question. The police officer didn't know. He's not a psychic. He can't mind read on how the court's going to interpret this. So we're going to give him the benefit of the doubt, and we're going to allow him to retain his qualified immunity. And so the standard is the police officer has to be acting in good faith, and he has to be reasonable. That's kind of the standard. It's reasonable is a real big standard in law. You got to be acting reasonable. Good faith is another big standard in law. You have to be acting in good faith. If the officer wasn't acting in good faith, then he's culpable. And if he wasn't being reasonable, he's being culpable. Now, a real good way of figuring out if an officer is not acting in good faith and is not being reasonable is if he is acting in a way that it's been prohibited by the courts. If the courts have already ruled that this is a protected right, and then the officer does it anyway, if he violates that right anyway, then it's next to impossible for him to say that he's acting in good faith and he's being reasonable, because the courts have ruled on it. They've made it known. They've been like, hey, coppers, you can't do this. So typically you'll see that in appellate decisions. You won't see that in district court decisions, because you can't expect the police to keep up with with district court decisions, but you can expect them to keep up with the relevant appellate decisions. Those should be disseminated to them in their little meetings, in their briefings, by their various captains and lieutenants, etc. So as far as this, so he's asking, he goes on to ask about a couple videos. I believe they are the same videos shown twice. There's this one, and then this is like an alternate view of it, I believe. These guys went out onto a pier in Miami Beach, Florida, openly carrying. Now, do I think that's a big deal? No. Do I think they should be allowed to do that? Yes. Am I pro Second Amendment? Absolutely. If it's not causing a problem, I personally, like, once you start pointing your gun at somebody, then absolutely the police should step in and take care of it. But just carrying a gun while you're fishing, I don't think is a big deal. The problem is the statute. This is the reference statute. This is 790.25. And there's an exception carved out for carrying a firearm, and that's if a person is engaged in fishing, camping, or lawful hunting, or going to or returning from a fishing, camping, or lawful hunting expedition. Now, this is vague, and you may not think it's vague, but it's vague, and I'll tell you why. What is a hunting expedition, and how do you define going to or returning from it? If I plan on going fishing in the Florida Keys, which I believe are the very southern tip of Florida, and I'm leaving from a city in the upper tip of it, in the bayou area, right next to, what is that? Alabama? Floribama, I think they call it. So I plan on crossing the entire state, the longest distance possible of Florida, to go fishing. But I'm not actually going to drive straight there. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take a week, and I'm going to make stops along the way. And I'm going to walk around those cities, just to stretch my legs on my long trip. But I am actually heading down to go hunting or fishing in the Florida Keys, so I get to carry my firearm for that whole week. I don't think a court's going to view that. Again, reasonable is a huge kind of standard that the courts are going to look at. So where do you define when a hunting expedition going to or returning from, how do you define when that is going on? And what was the intention of the legislator? Now, if you look at the construction, it says it shall be liberally construed. Okay, well, that's great. But fishing, do you think the legislators intended to go fishing on a city pier where you're perfectly safe? There's no need for a firearm. Do you think that's what they were intending? Or do you think they were intending on you going fishing in one of the bayous where there's alligators and bobcats and cougars and bears and wild pigs and things like that that can ruin your day or maybe kill your dog or something like that? Which fishing do you think the legislators were intending? What is the intent behind this? Is it anytime you go fishing? If you want to go fishing in a canal that's in the middle of the city, I assume they have those in Florida. I could be wrong. But let's say that there's a canal that's going through the city. Can you carry just to go fishing at that canal? What's your purpose? Can you carry anywhere in the city as long as you have a fishing pole in your hand? So yes, the courts are going to have to determine, and they may have already. I don't know how old this particular one is. History. Looks like 2006 was the last time it was updated. I could be wrong. But there probably are court cases that have determined what going to or from a expedition is and determined when you should have one fishing. I mean, if you're going to go camping, what if you're homeless and you just set up a tent? Are you camping at that point? Can you just carry a firearm all the time in public because you're camping? So it's the fuzzy edges. Like, I'm sure if these guys had open carried into some bayou, I think that's Louisiana, but you get what I'm saying, where there's alligators and snakes and all sorts of dangerous creatures. Do you think if they had their pistols with them there that the cops would have given two shits? I don't think they would have. So I understand what these guys are doing, and that's great. They may have a purpose to get arrested because then they can push to get the edges of the bubble expanded to allow for more open carry on piers while you're fishing. Do I think that that's like an enormous thing, like amazing, life-changing, oh goody, we get to carry a firearm while we're fishing off a pier? I don't think it's that big of a deal, but reasonable minds can reasonably differ, and if that's what you want to do, then I support you in doing it. Holy crap, it's blowing up. Anyway, I guess that's all I really have to say on this. So thank you for the question. I hope everybody had a chance to read it. And if you haven't had a chance to read it, well, I apologize. It's on Bunny Boots Discord server in the general tab. Thanks for watching. Have a great day.